The loneliest feeling in the world isn't being single. It's walking into a room full of people who already decided your story is over. Claire Bennett stood frozen outside the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate with one hand wrapped tightly around the strap of her small beige purse, while cold November wind brushed against the loose curls resting on her shoulders. Through the towering glass doors, she could already hear soft jazz music, clinking champagne glasses, and the warm bursts of laughter from families who still believed in forever. For a second, she considered turning around and driving the 40 miles back to her tiny apartment in Columbus, Ohio. She should never have come. But her younger cousin Olivia had begged her to attend the wedding, insisting that family was family no matter what happened in the past. Claire exhaled slowly and looked down at the simple navy blue dress she bought on clearance 3 days earlier after putting her 8-year-old son Ethan to bed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the nicest thing she owned. She stepped inside the ballroom and instantly felt the shift in the air. Conversations softened. Eyes moved toward her. Some people smiled politely while others whispered behind lifted champagne glasses. Claire recognized that look immediately. It was the same look people gave single mothers everywhere. A mix of pity, judgment, and curiosity. As if divorce had become her entire identity. She kept her chin up and walked carefully between the round tables covered in ivory roses and candlelight until she found her seat near the back corner of the room. Table 16. Right beside an empty chair. Of course. Her Aunt Diane noticed her almost immediately, and leaned toward another woman with a subtle expression that wasn't subtle at all. Claire caught a few scattered words floating through the music. Poor thing. Still alone. After all these years. She swallowed hard and sat down quietly, pretending not to hear any of it. Across the ballroom, couples leaned into each other effortlessly. Husbands adjusted their wives' shawls. Men held hands under tables. Even the older couples looked comfortable in ways Claire barely remembered anymore. She reached for the water glass in front of her just to keep her hands busy. Then came the voice from the stage. Tonight is proof that real love always finds a way. The wedding host announced warmly as guests applauded. And unlike some marriages these days, this one is built to last. A few people laughed softly. Claire felt the blood drain from her face because she knew the joke wasn't random. Her ex-husband's sister was close friends with Olivia. Everyone here knew Claire had been left alone with a baby and unpaid bills while her husband disappeared into another life 2 states away. She stared down at the untouched bread plate in front of her, praying the night would end quickly. That's when the chair beside her suddenly moved. Claire looked up, startled, as a tall man in a black tailored suit calmly pulled out the empty seat next to her. Conversations around the ballroom immediately quieted again, but this time for a completely different reason. Even Claire recognized him instantly. Adrian Cole, CEO of Cole Capital, the billionaire businessman whose face appeared on magazine covers and grocery store checkout lines. But instead of looking toward the crowd staring at him, Adrian adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and leaned slightly closer to Claire with a calm expression that revealed absolutely nothing. Then in a low, steady voice, he said 4 words that made her heart stop completely. Smile. They're watching. Claire stared at Adrian Cole as if her mind could not fully process what was happening. The ballroom around them had become strangely quiet, the kind of silence that only happened when powerful people entered a room unexpectedly. She could feel dozens of eyes locked onto their table, waiting to understand why one of the most recognizable businessmen in America had just sat beside a woman nobody had bothered speaking to all evening. Adrian reached calmly for the glass of water in front of him as though he belonged there. His dark suit looked effortlessly expensive under the chandelier lights, and unlike everyone else in the room trying too hard to impress each other, he seemed completely untouched by the attention surrounding him. Claire finally found her voice. "I think you may have the wrong table," she whispered nervously. Adrian glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "I do not." His voice was smooth and controlled, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who never repeated himself. Claire felt her pulse quicken. She had seen interviews with him before while folding laundry late at night after Ethan went to sleep. Financial magazines called him cold, ruthless, impossible to impress. But sitting this close to him now, she noticed something else entirely. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that settled deep behind someone's eyes after years of carrying too much responsibility alone. Before Claire could say another word, her Aunt Diane suddenly appeared beside the table with an overly bright smile that looked painfully forced. "Mr. Cole," she said quickly, nearly choking on surprise. "We had no idea you were attending Olivia's wedding." Adrian stood politely and shook her hand once. "Olivia's husband invited me." Diane blinked twice, clearly struggling to understand why a billionaire CEO would choose table 16 in the back corner, instead of the front near the family. Her gaze shifted suspiciously toward Claire. "And how exactly do you know our Claire?" Claire immediately opened her mouth, desperate to avoid whatever misunderstanding was about to happen, but Adrian answered first. "I came with her." The words landed like a glass shattering across the ballroom. Diane's entire face changed. Claire almost stopped breathing. Across the room, several guests openly stared now without even pretending to hide it. Someone near the dance floor whispered Adrian's name loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Claire leaned closer to him, panic rising in her chest. "Why would you say that?" she whispered under her breath. Adrian calmly adjusted the sleeve of his watch. "Because now they will stop looking at you like something is wrong with you." Claire froze. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Not after the divorce. Not after years of awkward holiday dinners, forced sympathy, and people acting as though being abandoned somehow made her less valuable. Adrian looked toward the stage while the wedding band quietly prepared for the next song. "People are predictable," he said softly. "The moment a woman sits alone, they invent reasons why she deserves it." Claire stared at him in disbelief because somehow this stranger had described exactly how the last 8 years of her life had felt. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted them. "Claire." She turned and immediately felt her stomach tighten. Her ex-husband Mark stood beside the table wearing an expensive gray suit, and the same confident smile that used to make her trust him years ago. Except tonight, the smile faded the instant he recognized the man sitting beside her. "Adrian Cole?" Mark asked slowly, clearly stunned. Adrian finally looked up at him with calm indifference. "You must be Mark." Claire felt the air shift again. Mark tried to recover quickly, straightening his posture while extending his hand. "I am surprised you know who I am." Adrian stood and shook his hand once before replying in the same composed tone. "Claire mentioned you." Claire almost choked because she had not mentioned Mark at all. Claire could barely breathe as Mark slowly lowered his hand from the handshake. The confident expression he walked over with had completely disappeared now, replaced by visible confusion and something far more uncomfortable. Jealousy. Around them, nearby guests openly pretended not to listen while clearly listening to every single word. Claire knew exactly what they were all thinking. Why would a man like Adrian Cole know anything about her at all? Mark forced out a small laugh and glanced between them. "That is surprising," he said carefully. "Claire and I have not exactly stayed close." Adrian remained calm, almost unreadably calm, as he slipped one hand into his pocket. People do not always need to stay together to leave an impact on each other. The answer sounded polite on the surface, but Claire noticed the subtle tension in Mark's jaw immediately afterward. For the first time in years, Mark looked uncertain of himself around her. And somehow that unsettled Claire more than anything else. She was used to being overlooked. Used to shrinking herself at family gatherings so nobody felt uncomfortable around the divorced single mother. But tonight the entire room seemed unable to stop watching her table. The wedding band began playing soft piano music in the background while servers moved between tables carrying plates of filet mignon and roasted potatoes. Yet all Claire could focus on was the strange shift happening around her. People who ignored her 20 minutes ago were suddenly smiling at her. One of Olivia's bridesmaids even walked over to compliment Claire's dress despite never speaking to her before. It was humiliating in a different way. Not because people were being cruel now, but because their kindness suddenly depended on the man sitting beside her. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, it was nice seeing you, Claire." But before he stepped away, Adrian spoke again. "How is your son doing?" Mark blinked. Claire felt her entire body tense. Ethan had not seen his father in almost 6 months except for a short birthday phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "He is good." Adrian studied him quietly for a moment. "That is good to hear." Nothing about his tone sounded aggressive, yet somehow Mark looked smaller afterward. Claire could not explain it. Adrian never raised his voice, never challenged him directly, but every word carried the steady confidence of someone completely secure in his place in the world. Mark mumbled another goodbye before finally walking away toward the bar. Claire watched him leave, stunned by how different the interaction felt compared to the past. Usually Mark controlled every conversation without effort. Usually she was the one left feeling embarrassed or overly emotional afterward. Tonight was different. Adrian sat back down beside her as if nothing unusual had happened. "You did not have to do that," Claire whispered softly. Adrian picked up the folded dinner menu from the table. "Yes, I did." Claire stared at him. "Why?" He glanced toward the dance floor where Olivia and her new husband were laughing during photographs. "Because humiliation becomes a habit if nobody interrupts it." The sentence hit her harder than she expected. Claire looked down at her hands resting in her lap. She hated how emotional she suddenly felt over simple kindness. After years of carrying everything alone, even basic protection felt unfamiliar. Across the ballroom, she noticed several women whispering while openly staring at Adrian. One of them quickly looked away when Claire caught her. "This is insane," Claire muttered under her breath. Adrian almost smiled for the first time all night. "No," he said quietly. "This is temporary." Claire frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Before Adrian could answer, the host returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced cheerfully, "it is time for the couple's dance." A wave of applause filled the ballroom. Claire immediately reached for her purse. "I should probably go to the restroom or something." But Adrian gently touched the edge of her chair before she could stand. "Claire." She looked at him nervously. Adrian held her gaze for one long second before saying the words that made her heart race all over again. "Do not run every time people look at you." Claire looked at Adrian while the music swelled softly across the ballroom, and for a moment she forgot how to speak. Around them, couples slowly began moving toward the dance floor beneath the golden chandelier lights while servers dimmed the room slightly to create a softer glow. It should have felt romantic. Instead, Claire felt exposed, vulnerable. Every instinct told her to escape before she embarrassed herself even more tonight. "I have not danced in years," she admitted quietly. Adrian stood from his chair and straightened the sleeve of his jacket with calm precision. "Neither have I." Claire almost laughed nervously. "I seriously doubt that." Adrian finally looked directly at her again, his expression unreadable but strangely gentle beneath the cold composure he carried so naturally. "Most people assume rich men spend their lives attending glamorous parties," he said. "Most of those parties are exhausting." Claire stared at him for a second before lowering her eyes. There was something unexpectedly lonely about the way he said it. The ballroom lights reflected softly against his. Watch as he extended his hand toward her without another word. Claire hesitated. Her heart pounded so loudly she was convinced people nearby could hear it. She became painfully aware of every small detail about herself all over again. Her inexpensive dress. Her nervous posture. The fact that she was 34 years old and suddenly acting like a teenager because an impossibly successful man was asking her to dance. But then she noticed the way people were watching again. Waiting for her reaction. Waiting for her to retreat back into the invisible corner everyone expected her to stay in. Slowly, Claire placed her hand in his. Adrian's hand was warm and steady as he guided her toward the dance floor. The entire room seemed to shift around them. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Claire even caught Olivia staring from across the ballroom with open confusion. Nobody understood what was happening, including Claire herself. Adrian rested one hand carefully at her waist while keeping a respectful distance between them. Nothing about him felt careless or inappropriate. Every movement was controlled, calm, almost protective. Claire placed her hand lightly against his shoulder as soft piano music filled the room. "You are very good at pretending," she whispered awkwardly. Adrian looked down at her for a brief moment. "Who said I am pretending?" The question caught her completely off guard. Before she could respond, another couple brushed past them on the crowded dance floor, and Adrian instinctively pulled Claire slightly closer to avoid bumping into her. It was a simple movement. Small. Natural. But Claire suddenly became aware of how long it had been since someone treated her gently without expecting something in return. She looked away quickly before he noticed the emotion building in her eyes. "You still have not explained why you are doing this," she said softly after a moment. Adrian glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where several men in expensive suits were openly watching him now. "Because tonight everyone in this room already decided who you were before you even sat down." Claire swallowed hard. "And what do you think I am?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Someone who is tired of apologizing for surviving difficult things." Claire felt something inside her chest tighten painfully, because no one had ever described her life so accurately before. Not her family. Not her friends. Not even Mark during the years they were together. Adrian's eyes softened slightly as he studied her expression. "You look surprised," he said quietly. Claire gave a faint laugh filled with emotion she could barely contain. "Most people only notice the fact that I am divorced." Adrian's hand remained steady against her waist as the music continued around them. "That says more about them than it does about you." Claire looked up at him slowly, and for the first time all evening, she stopped feeling embarrassed about existing in the room. Then she noticed several women whispering near the champagne tower again while staring directly at her. One of them leaned closer to another, and said something that made both of them visibly shocked. Claire frowned slightly. "I think people are starting rumors already." Adrian did not even glance in their direction. People create stories anytime they cannot understand something. Claire let out a nervous breath. "And what story are we giving them?" Adrian lowered his voice just enough for only her to hear. "That you are not someone they get to pity anymore." The music slowly faded as the couple's dance ended, but Adrian did not immediately let go of Claire's hand. Around them, guests returned to their tables while conversations grew louder again, fueled now by curiosity and speculation. Claire could practically feel the rumors spreading across the ballroom like wildfire. Every glance in her direction felt different now. Not pity. Not judgment. Something closer to fascination. And somehow that made her even more uneasy. Adrian guided her carefully away from the crowded dance floor before finally releasing her hand near a quieter hallway lined with tall windows overlooking the estate gardens. Outside, tiny white lights wrapped around the trees glowed against the cold Ohio night. Claire exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. "I think half the room believes we are secretly married," she muttered. Nervously, Adrian loosened the cuff of his jacket slightly. That would explain the staring. Claire let out a small laugh despite herself, surprising both of them. For the first time all evening, the tension in her chest softened just enough for her to breathe normally. They stood quietly for a moment while distant laughter echoed from the ballroom behind them. Then Adrian spoke again. "You hide discomfort very politely." Claire folded her arms lightly across herself. Single mothers learn that skill quickly. Adrian studied her face carefully. "You say that like you have spent years apologizing for something that was never your fault." Claire looked away toward the dark garden outside the window because the truth in his voice felt dangerously personal. She did not understand how a stranger could read her so easily. "When you become a single mother at 26, she said quietly, "people stop seeing you as a woman first. They see you as a warning." Adrian remained silent, listening in a way most people never did anymore. Claire swallowed hard before continuing. "At first everyone says they support you. But after a while, they start treating your life like a lesson about bad decisions." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "Even when they do not know the whole story." Adrian's expression darkened slightly. "And what is the whole story?" Claire hesitated. She had not planned on opening up tonight, especially not to someone like him. But something about Adrian felt strangely safe. Not warm exactly. Not openly emotional. Just steady. Like someone who would hold the truth carefully once you gave it to him. Claire looked down at the wedding ring tan line that had never fully faded from her left hand. "I was 7 months pregnant when I found out Mark was seeing someone else," she admitted softly. "He said he felt trapped. Said he was not ready to be a father." Even after all these years, saying the words out loud still hurt in ways she hated admitting. Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Claire continued quietly before emotion could stop her. "I remember sitting alone in the hospital after Ethan was born because Mark never showed up that night. I kept staring at the hallway thinking maybe he would walk through the door eventually." Her voice weakened slightly. "But he never did." Silence settled between them for several long seconds. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind that forms when someone finally reveals the part of themselves they usually protect at all costs. Adrian looked out toward the dark garden for a moment before speaking. Men like that usually spend the rest of their lives searching for what they already had. Claire blinked slowly, surprised by the bitterness hidden beneath his calm tone. You sound like you know something about regret. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the ballroom where laughter and music continued behind closed doors. I know what it looks like when someone realizes too late what mattered. Claire studied him carefully now. There it was again. That sadness behind his composure. Not weakness. Not self-pity. Loss. Real loss. Before she could ask another question, Adrian's phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. He glanced briefly at the screen before locking it again without replying. Claire noticed the exhaustion return instantly to his eyes. You can leave if you need to, she said softly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. I have spent most of my life leaving places early. Then his voice lowered slightly. Tonight I would rather stay. Claire stared at Adrian after he said those words, and something inside her shifted quietly. She could not remember the last time someone chose to stay beside her without obligation. Most people in her life eventually became temporary. Friends got busy. Family kept their distance. Mark disappeared emotionally long before he physically left. But Adrian stood there beside the tall windows overlooking the cold gardens as if leaving had never crossed his mind at all. The ballroom doors opened briefly behind them, letting warm music spill into the hallway again before closing. Claire brushed a loose curl behind her ear nervously. You talk like someone who spends too much time alone, she said softly. Adrian gave the faintest hint of a smile. That is because I do. Claire studied him carefully. It was strange hearing a man with everything speak like someone who had nothing personal waiting for him at the end of the day. I do not understand, she admitted quietly. You are Adrian Cole. You could walk into any room in America and have people fighting for your attention. Adrian's gaze moved toward the ballroom where laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Attention and connection are not the same thing. The answer settled heavily between them. Claire suddenly understood why his presence felt different from other wealthy men she had encountered over the years through clients at the dental office where she worked reception. Adrian never seemed interested in impressing anyone. If anything, he looked exhausted by people constantly trying to impress him. Claire crossed her arms lightly against the chill near the windows. So why come to a wedding if you hate events like this? Adrian was quiet for a moment before answering. Olivia's husband works with my company occasionally. He insisted I should come because he said weddings remind people what matters. Claire noticed the subtle pause before he continued speaking. Personally, I think weddings mostly remind people of what they lost. She looked at him carefully now. Someone hurt you? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and slowly turned a silver ring between his fingers before slipping it back out of sight again. Claire's heart tightened slightly at the movement. Her name was Natalie, he said finally, his voice calm but quieter now. We were together for 6 years. Claire remained silent, sensing how rare it was for him to speak personally at all. Adrian leaned one shoulder lightly against the wall near the window. She died 3 months before the wedding. Claire felt her breath catch instantly. Adrian? He shook his head gently as if stopping her from apologizing. A drunk driver crossed the median during a rainstorm outside Chicago. His tone never changed dramatically, but somehow that made the grief underneath it even more painful to hear. Claire pressed her lips together, suddenly understanding the sadness she had noticed in him since the moment he sat beside her. It was not temporary sadness. It was permanent absence. The kind people learn to carry quietly because setting it down becomes impossible. That was 5 years ago, Adrian continued. After that, work became easier than people. Claire looked down briefly, overwhelmed by how vulnerable this conversation had become. I think pain changes the way you move through the world, she admitted softly. Adrian nodded once. It also changes what you notice. Claire frowned slightly. What do you mean? Adrian looked directly at her now. Most people in that ballroom saw a divorced woman sitting alone tonight. His expression softened almost invisibly. I saw someone trying very hard not to let loneliness embarrass her. Claire felt emotion rise suddenly in her chest again before she could stop it. No one had ever looked past the surface so quickly before. The strange part was that Adrian did not sound pitying when he spoke to her. He sounded observant, honest, as though he simply noticed things other people ignored. Before Claire could respond, laughter erupted near the ballroom entrance as several guests walked past the hallway. One woman glanced toward them and whispered something to her husband while staring openly at Adrian standing beside Claire. Claire let out a nervous breath. Tomorrow everyone in this family will think we are having some secret affair. Adrian looked completely unfazed. Tomorrow they will talk about something else. Claire shook her head faintly. You really do not care what people think. Adrian looked at her carefully for one long second before replying. That is because I learned the hard way that the people who matter usually see the truth eventually. Then his voice lowered slightly. And the people who do not see it were never worth exhausting yourself for in the first place. Claire should have stepped away from Adrian then. She knew that. The conversation had already become far more personal than anything that should happen between two people who technically met less than 2 hours ago. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, she felt strangely calm standing beside him in the quiet hallway while music drifted softly from the ballroom behind them. It scared her a little how natural it felt. Adrian glanced briefly toward the entrance as another group of guests passed by. You are thinking too hard, he said quietly. Claire blinked. How do you know that? Because you keep twisting your bracelet whenever you are nervous. Claire immediately looked down at her wrist in surprise. She had not even realized she was doing it. Adrian noticed tiny things constantly, not in an intrusive way, more like someone who had spent years carefully studying people because he trusted very few of them. Claire let out a soft breath. You notice everything, do not you? Adrian's expression remained calm. Only the things that matter. Before Claire could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them again. There you are. Claire turned instantly and felt her stomach tighten as Mark approached down the hallway holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He stopped several feet away from them, clearly trying to appear relaxed despite the tension visible in his face. I was wondering where you disappeared to, he said, looking directly at Claire instead of Adrian. Claire folded her arms lightly. I needed air. Mark nodded slowly before extending one of the glasses toward her. I thought maybe we could talk for a minute. Adrian remained silent beside her, but his presence alone seemed to unsettle Mark more with every passing second. Claire stared at the drink for a moment before shaking her head gently. I am fine. Mark lowered the glass awkwardly. Come on, Claire. We have known each other for over a decade. We can at least have one normal conversation. Claire almost laughed at the word normal. There had never been anything normal about the way Mark drifted in and out of her life whenever it suited him emotionally. But before she could answer, Mark's attention shifted toward Adrian again. I still cannot believe this, he admitted with a strained smile. A guy like you showing up here with Claire. The sentence landed exactly the way Mark intended it to. Claire felt humiliation rise immediately in her chest. Not because of Adrian, because she recognized the implication instantly. A woman like her could never naturally belong beside a man like him. But Adrian never reacted emotionally. He simply looked at Mark with the same composed expression he had maintained all night. And what exactly is a woman like Claire? Mark froze slightly, clearly not expecting the direct question. That is not what I meant. Adrian's voice remained perfectly calm. Then explain what you meant. Claire could practically feel the shift in power happening between them. Mark suddenly looked uncertain in a way she had never seen before. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I just meant, our lives are very different. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Claire spends her life raising a child mostly alone, while still showing up for people who barely appreciate her. His tone never rose even slightly. That does sound very different. Claire felt emotion catch unexpectedly in her throat. Mark looked embarrassed now, glancing briefly toward the ballroom as though hoping someone would interrupt the conversation and save him from it. But Adrian was not finished. Do you know what I noticed tonight? He asked quietly. Mark said nothing. Adrian's gaze remained steady. Every person in this room suddenly treats Claire differently because they saw her standing beside me. The disappointment in his voice felt sharper than anger would have. That says something deeply unfortunate about the people around her. Claire stared at Adrian, stunned again by how effortlessly he defended her without sounding performative or cruel. Mark shifted uncomfortably. Look, maybe I made mistakes in the past. Claire almost flinched hearing him say it so casually. Mistakes. As though abandoning a pregnant wife emotionally could be reduced to a convenient word at a wedding reception. Adrian studied him for one long second before replying quietly. The problem with selfish decisions is that other people usually carry the consequences much longer than you do. Silence filled the hallway completely after that. Mark finally looked at Claire directly, but for the first time in years, she did not feel small under his attention anymore. And somehow that changed everything. Mark stood there awkwardly for another few seconds, clearly searching for a response that would somehow restore the confidence he walked into the hallway with earlier. But nothing came. The silence around them felt too honest now, too exposed. Finally he forced out a tight smile toward Claire. I should probably get back inside. Claire nodded politely without saying anything else. Mark glanced one last time at Adrian before walking back toward the ballroom, his shoulders noticeably stiffer than before. The moment he disappeared through the doors, Claire released a slow breath she did not realize she had been holding. Adrian remained beside her quietly, giving her space instead of immediately speaking. Somehow that made his presence feel even more comforting. Claire looked down at the floor for a moment before shaking her head faintly. You did not have to defend me like that. Adrian slipped his hands into his pockets calmly. Yes, I did. Claire looked up at him again. Why? Adrian's expression softened almost invisibly beneath the warm hallway lighting. Because people become careless with kind women once they assume those women will forgive anything. Claire felt those words settle deep inside her chest. It was terrifying how accurately he seemed to understand parts of her life she rarely admitted out loud. She gave a quiet laugh filled with disbelief. You know, earlier tonight I was worried everyone here would spend the wedding staring at me because I came alone. Adrian tilted his head slightly. And now? Claire glanced toward the ballroom doors where muffled music continued behind them. Now they are staring for completely different reasons. Adrian almost smiled again. Almost. Humans are simple, he said softly. They worship status more than character. Claire crossed her arms lightly. You really do not think very highly of people. Adrian looked toward the dark gardens outside the windows again. I think highly of a few people. That is different. Before Claire could answer, the ballroom doors suddenly opened again and Olivia rushed toward them, still wearing her wedding gown and carrying the edge of her dress carefully in one hand. Her face looked overwhelmed in the way brides often did halfway through receptions. There you are, she said breathlessly to Claire before glancing nervously at Adrian. And wow, this is still surreal. Claire immediately felt embarrassed again. Olivia, this is not what it looks like. Olivia lowered her voice instantly. Claire, half the wedding thinks you are secretly dating Adrian Cole. Claire closed her eyes briefly in humiliation. Adrian remained perfectly composed beside her. Olivia looked between them carefully before speaking again. Actually, there is something else. Claire frowned slightly. What happened? Olivia hesitated. Someone posted a photo of you two dancing online. Claire's stomach dropped instantly. What? Olivia quickly pulled out her phone and showed the screen to her. There it was. A photo captured from across the ballroom showing Adrian holding Claire during the couple's dance beneath the chandelier lights. The image looked strangely intimate despite how respectful the moment actually was. Thousands of people had already viewed it. Claire's face lost color as she read the comments underneath. Who is she? Did Adrian Cole secretly remarry? Single mom lands billionaire CEO. Claire immediately handed the phone back, horrified. This is insane. Olivia bit her lip nervously. The internet already picked it up because Adrian trends constantly. Claire looked toward Adrian in panic. This could hurt your reputation. Adrian barely reacted at all. It will disappear in a few days. But before anyone could say another word, his phone rang sharply in his pocket. Adrian glanced at the screen and for the first time all night, Claire saw visible irritation cross his face. He answered calmly. What is it? Claire could only hear one side of the conversation, but Adrian's expression slowly hardened as he listened. Olivia awkwardly excused herself and slipped back into the ballroom, leaving Claire standing alone beside him again. After several quiet seconds, Adrian finally spoke into the phone. No, I am not discussing my personal life with the board tonight. Claire looked at him carefully as realization settled over her. This was bigger than gossip. Bigger than family whispers at a wedding. Adrian ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket with controlled calm, but the tension in his jaw remained. Claire spoke softly. Your company saw the photo. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. My company monitors everything. Claire suddenly felt guilty in a way she had not expected. I am sorry. Adrian frowned slightly. For what? Claire looked down at her hands. For dragging you into something messy. Adrian stepped a little closer then, not enough to overwhelm her, just enough that his voice became quieter and more personal. Claire. She slowly looked up at him. Adrian held her gaze steadily before saying the words that made her heart stumble all over again. You are not something messy. Claire stared at Adrian after he said those words, and for a moment the noise from the ballroom disappeared completely. You are not something messy. No one had ever said that to her before. Not when she was struggling to pay rent while raising Ethan alone. Not when she worked double shifts at the dental office after daycare costs increased again. Not even during the nights she sat awake wondering whether becoming a single mother had permanently changed how the world saw her. But Adrian looked at her as though none of those things made her smaller. As though surviving difficult years had added value to her instead of taking it away. Claire lowered her eyes quickly because the emotion building inside her chest suddenly felt impossible to hide. You should probably go back inside, she whispered softly. Your board already sounds angry enough. Adrian remained still beside her. My board is always angry about something. Claire gave a faint laugh despite herself. That cannot possibly be true. Adrian's expression relaxed slightly. Last month they were angry because I canceled a shareholder dinner to attend my nephew's school concert. Claire blinked in surprise. You went to a school concert? He had one line in the Christmas play, Adrian replied calmly. He spent 2 weeks practicing it. Claire smiled before she could stop herself. The image felt strangely normal compared to the cold billionaire reputation the world attached to him. Adrian noticed the smile immediately, and something softer passed through his expression for a brief second. Then his phone vibrated again. This time he silenced it without even checking the screen. Claire stared at him carefully. You really do not care what they think, do you? Adrian looked toward the ballroom doors where guests continued laughing and dancing beneath warm lights. I spent years building a company, he said quietly. But somewhere along the way, people started confusing business success with permission to control every part of my life. Claire folded her arms lightly against the cold. And what do you want? Adrian looked back at her slowly. Peace. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard again. Not power. Not attention. Peace. Claire understood that answer more than she wanted to admit. They stood quietly together for several seconds until soft snow finally began drifting outside beyond the tall garden windows. Tiny white flakes floated beneath the estate lights, making the night suddenly feel calmer somehow. Claire smiled faintly at the sight. Ethan would love this, she said without thinking. Adrian glanced toward her. Your son likes snow? Claire nodded. Every winter he waits for the first snowfall like it is a national holiday. Her voice softened automatically when speaking about him. He still believes snow days are magical. Adrian listened carefully the way he always did. How old is he? 8. Adrian gave a small nod. That is a good age. Claire looked at him curiously. You are good with kids, aren't you? A quieter expression crossed his face. Natalie wanted children. Claire felt her chest tighten gently again at the mention of her name. Adrian looked out toward the snowfall beyond the windows. For a long time after she died, I stopped imagining a future entirely. His voice remained calm, but Claire could hear the loneliness underneath it now more clearly than before. Work became easier because numbers do not disappoint you emotionally. Claire stared at him for a moment before speaking softly. You know what is strange? Adrian looked at her. Tonight is probably the first time in years that neither of us expected to feel understood by anyone. Adrian held her gaze quietly. The air between them suddenly felt heavier now, filled with things neither of them completely knew how to say yet. Then from inside the ballroom, the wedding host's voice echoed loudly through the speakers again. Ladies and gentlemen, before we end the evening, we have one final champagne toast for love. Applause erupted from inside the reception hall. Claire glanced toward the doors uncertainly. I should probably head home soon. My babysitter has an early shift tomorrow morning. Adrian nodded once, though something unreadable crossed his face afterward. I will walk you out. They slowly started toward the ballroom entrance together, and for the first time all night, Claire noticed people no longer looked at her with pity when she entered the room beside him. They looked at her as though she mattered, as though she belonged somewhere again. But what unsettled her most was realizing she no longer needed their approval nearly as much as she did a few hours earlier. Because somewhere between the music, the whispered conversations, and the snowfall outside those tall estate windows, a stranger had quietly reminded her that being abandoned did not make someone unworthy of being chosen again.